Today I'm going to replace the front brake pads and brake rotors on this 2007 Pontiac Vibe. The first thing I'll do is remove the hubcap. The next thing I'll do is just loosen the lug nuts, not take them off or anything like that. I'm just going to loosen them up. The next thing I'll do is jack the car up. Okay, the next thing I'll do is finish taking the lug nuts off. Okay, now I can take off the... Okay, just so you can kind of see what's going on here. We've got the brake caliper that's going to need to come off, and the brake pads are behind the caliper there, and we're also going to replace this rotor, which once the brake caliper is removed, we'll have to remove this caliper bracket in order to let the rotor come off of the hub. Okay, I'm using a 14mm ratchet wrench, and I'm just going to start removing these caliper bolts and knocking my light sources out of the way here in the process. So that one's loose, and now we'll do the bottom one. Okay, so those will spin out by hand now. And it looks like the top and bottom bolts are the same. Okay, and I'll use a screwdriver here to kind of help pry this thing away from the bracket. So you can see as the caliper itself slides out of here, the pads kind of stay behind in the bracket. So once this is free, I'm going to pull it up and set it up here out of the way, making sure that the hose, the brake hose here, doesn't pinch or kink. Now that the caliper's out of the way, I can pull the pad out of here by just prying on it, and you can see it kind of goes in these metal clips that are on top and bottom of the caliper bracket, and it just kind of slides out. And there you can see the pad itself. Now this pad probably still has a little bit of life left in it, but the brakes have been making a little bit of noise, not squeaking or grinding or anything, but they're just a little bit noisier than they used to be. And since it's summertime, I figured it was a good time to change these pads rather than wait until the dead of winter when it's 30 below zero and not conducive to working on the cars. So let me pull the back pad off. And again, that's kind of the same process. Okay, I'm attempting to show behind the caliper now, or behind the wheel hub assembly. You can see there are a couple of bolts that need to come out. This is the caliper bracket here, and then this bolt down here is one of the bolts that holds on the bracket. And then there's also another one up there. So the next task will be to pull those up. Okay, in order to remove the caliper bracket, I'm going to use a 17mm. Okay, you can see here I went underneath. My breaker bar is just a little bit too long to fit in the wheel well. But once I was able to get some leverage on that, it seems to have loosened up fine. Okay, so now that's almost finger loose. So now I'll do the next one, the top one. Okay, so it looks like the top one, I'm not going to be able to get a deep drive socket on there. There's the CV, or actually part of the steering knuckle or something is in the way, so I'm going to go get a shallow 17mm socket. Okay, so let's try this. I've got a shallower socket now with my long breaker bar, and it still almost doesn't fit, but I'll try it anyway. There we go. Okay, so now I'll just use a regular 3/8 ratchet to work those off. Actually, they feel finger loose now, really. Okay, and just like on the caliper, both of these bracket bolts are the same, so we don't have to worry about mixing those up. Now I should be able to just slide this bracket out of the way, and you can kind of see what it looks like. It's got these clips in it for the pads to slide on, and then it's got the slider pin, the caliper slider pins as well. Okay, so now with everything else out of the way, I can take the brake rotor off, but these are generally a little tough to get off just because the center kind of rusts onto the hub of the wheel. So I'm going to squirt a little bit of penetrating oil in there and let that work in for a few minutes, and then see if we can get this off. Okay, so I've let that penetrating oil soak in a little bit. Hopefully that'll help. And now I'm just going to try and tap it with this hammer. Okay, so you can see after some heavy persuasion, I was able to get this off. Now, normally I wouldn't use a hammer like this on something like this. This is a dead blow hammer, and it could warp the rotor. So if you're trying to remove the rotor and save it, I wouldn't beat on it with a hammer like that. But I couldn't find my regular rubber mallet. It seems to have gone missing. But here you can see is the old rotor, and it looks like it's not in bad shape, but the brakes do pulse a little, so this may be slightly warped or out of round. I probably could take it and have it machined, but I've never had good luck with that. Once I have the rotor machined, it usually starts warping or pulsing again in the brake pedal not long after I have it machined, so I usually just replace them. Okay, so here's the new rotor next to the old rotor, and you can see that the new rotor, if I can get the camera to focus, is a Napa premium rotor, and there's the part number. And again, that's good for a 2007 Pontiac Vibe. Okay, and just as a point of comparison, there are the two rotors side by side, and they look more or less the same, so that's good to note. Okay, so I will now spray these down with some brake cleaner here, just to get any of the releasing oils and all that off of it. There's, just a light coating of oil, and you don't want that, especially on this surface, where the brake pads are going to contact, so that everything beds in good. You want it nice and clean. Okay, we'll flip them over and do the other sides. With the reassembly process, by putting the rotor back on. And now, one of the things I like to do here is put on a couple of lug nuts. One is probably sufficient, actually, just to hold the rotor in place while I get the bracket and everything back on. Otherwise it wants to kind of fall out like you saw, or fall forward because of the gravity. So putting a lug nut on there will just help kind of hold it in place while I continue to work on it. You can see here the pads that I've chosen to use are the Adaptive One brake pads from Napa, and I've had good luck with these pads on other vehicles. They seem to stop well, And one of the things that's a pet peeve of mine about brake pads is all the dust that they generate that gets on the rim. In fact, you may be able to see it on my truck there in the background. That rim is kind of dusty from lower grade brake pads. That one doesn't have these Adaptive One pads on it, and the rims get dusty and kind of ruined. So I found that these generate very little dust and seem to perform pretty well. So this is what I've been using on my other vehicles. In the brake pad kit, you can see there are the brake pads themselves. There's some grease here and some clips. The next thing that I'll do is grease these caliper slide pins. Now these are what allow the caliper and pads to kind of float on here, and as the caliper compresses the pads onto the rotor and releases it, this allows everything to move freely. And these actually feel like they're in pretty good shape. Maybe they don't even need to be greased, but while I've got everything out, I'm going to at least take a look at them. So the thing to do is to extend the slide pin out and pull this rubber boot away from the slide pin, and you can kind of see the pin. I'll pull it all the way out, and there does seem to be, you know, a fair amount of grease in there. Everything seems nice and wet. If these were dried out, they'd start to seize up, and that'll cause problems with the brakes. But since I've got them out, I'll put a little bit more grease in there. Now the grease I use on these is this Napa Sil Glide. I've had very good luck with this stuff in the past. This is a nice high heat grease, and it's specifically designed for caliper pins. So I'm going to pull this one back out, and I'm going to just spread a little bit on. Don't need a lot. And I think there's probably already some down inside the boot there, inside the rubber boot, but I'll add a little bit more just to have some in there. And now that that's greased up, I'll slide this back in. And now what's important to note is that this rubber boot needs to be seated along this groove here on the end of the caliper pin. If this boot is not seated around this groove, then water and moisture can leak in and the grease will leak out, and eventually the pins will rust and the calipers will seize. So getting that over that lip is very important, and also making sure that the boot is seated and sealed inside the caliper bracket is important as well. Put that back together, and just like before, I'll make sure that that boot seats over that lip and is on there good. And now we should be good. The next thing I'm going to do is replace these clips that are in the caliper bracket with the new ones from the package here. Okay, as you can see here, these 4 clips seem to be the same, so I'm going to take 2 of them and set them aside for the other side. And now what I'll do is just pull the old ones out. And those are just held in with friction and, in this case, rust. So I'll just pull them out of there, and now what I'm going to do is kind of clean this up with a wire brush and get some of the loose rust off and everything, so that these will seat in there better. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to do is clip these in, and they just clip over. I don't know how visible that is. There's kind of a tab here in the side of the caliper, and this spring clip just kind of fits over that and locks into place. So we'll just kind of pop this in like that. And that should be pretty much all there is to it. I'll do the other one now. Okay, now that the caliper pins are all greased up and the clips are installed, I can just put this bracket back over the wheel. And just want to get that sort of roughly in place, and then take the old hold down bolt and try and line everything up here and here. Okay, so I've got that snugged up, and now what I'm going to do is get the breaker bar and torque that up. Now I don't have the exact torque settings for this, I just kind of go by feel, but you may want to look up the correct torque settings for these bolts if you're doing this job yourself. I'm sure that information is readily available online or in a service manual, but I just kind of go by feel. But you don't want to over tighten these bolts because you could stretch them, and you certainly don't want to under tighten them either. Okay, before I slide the pads into place, I'm going to put a little more of this sill glide, and I'm going to put it in these grooves where the pads sit. I'm not going to put a lot, just need a little bit. That'll help get the pads to slide in. And it's also, I guess, helpful to keep everything moving, although I would tend to think this stuff will dry out after a while on there, so I'm not sure how beneficial it really is, but I'll put a little on there for the heck of it. So I'm going to start with the outer pad and just kind of show how that goes in. You can see the pads are marked outer and inner there, and these tabs just kind of go into these grooves and slide in. Now the outer pad has to kind of slip underneath this part of the bracket and then work its way into the clips, kind of like that, and like that, and the spring force of these clips tries to push it back out. So you got to get everything kind of lined up. This usually takes me a couple of tries to do. There. Okay, so the outer one is in place fairly well there. Now the inner one needs to go in. And of course it's hard to see. The inner one doesn't have this bracket to deal with, but I can't see. So what I'm going to do is spin the wheel a little bit so that I can see the back of the caliper bracket, so I can slide that pad in place. Okay, so I've got the wheel turned as much as I can, and now I'll try and slide this inner pad in place. And let's see, getting everything lined up there. Okay, so that seemed to have gone in pretty easily there. Okay, the next thing that I'm going to do, you can see the caliper up here, is as the brake pads wear, this caliper piston pushes out. I'll try and tip this caliper up so you can see. So this is extended a bit. We need to push that back in. And before I do this, I'm going to clean up some of the dirt and grime around this so that when I push this back in, it doesn't get trapped in that boot and rip it or cause it to bind or anything like that. Now, one thing that's in here that makes it look a little rougher than it really is the last time I did this job, I put some of that silicone disc brake quiet on here, and I don't know if that stuff is really all that necessary or not. I've used it on some cars and not used it on others, and I've never had a problem one way or the other. So it seems like it just causes more of a problem, or more of a mess than anything else. So I've decided to leave it off of this one. So now with that cleaned up, what I'm going to do is put a little more of the sill glide on the boot here, and that'll just help keep that from binding as I compress it. Now don't want to use WD-40 or anything like that, as the solvents in there will kind of dry the boot out. So the Sil-Glide seems to be good. It's a silicone-based lubricant. And you don't want too much either, because you don't want this to drip onto the brake rotor over time and get grease in the wear surfaces. But I'll put a little on there anyway. In fact, there's probably just a bit too much. I'll wipe some of it off. Now it should be good to compress that caliper. Now for compressing the caliper piston, some people like to use a C-clamp or something. I have this pair of vice grips with these nice pivoting pads on the end that I like to use. And I'll just get these adjusted. And you can see I can put the vice grip right inside the piston. And then I can tighten this up a little bit. Now I'll release it, tighten it a little bit more, and now I should be able to just compress this nice and evenly without too much trouble. I need to tighten it a little more. And I'm just going slowly, applying kind of even pressure and letting the piston kind of work its way in, not forcing it or anything like that. And I want to make sure I don't push it in too far. I'm not sure if it'll bottom out or seat itself in the bore or not, but I'll push it in a little tiny bit more just to make sure. But you don't want to push it in too far, because then it could bind. Okay, I'm going to leave a little bit of the lip exposed on the piston. You can always push it in a little bit more if you have to, if things don't fit, but you can't easily pull it back out. So we'll just try it that way and see how things go. Alright, so now I'll just put this back in place. And I want to make sure I don't bind up that brake hose putting it back in. So now, lining it back up, I want to make sure that this piece and the piston fit over the pads, and that this piece aligns to the slider boots back here properly. And you may need to push in the slider pins a little bit just to get everything kind of back in place. Okay, one thing to note on here, not sure how visible it is, if I can get the lighting right with this flashlight. These caliper pins, the ends of them are not round. They're sort of an odd round with flats. And they need to twist and kind of fit in against the caliper ear so they don't spin when you tighten the bolts up. So I've got the top one good. I'll just check the bottom one and make sure that's in the right position. Okay, with the slider pins oriented properly, I can now just put the hold down bolts back in. Okay, now with the bolts tight, finger tight, I can just tighten them the rest of the way with the ratchet. Now again, there are proper torque settings for this. I'm not obviously using a torque wrench or anything, but if you're going to attempt this may, or using the correct torque values is probably a good idea, especially if you're not familiar with working on brakes or cars in general. Okay, so I've spun the wheel back so it's straight, and just taking a look at everything, it looks good. There isn't any binding. You want to make sure you can spin this. Of course, the car is in park right now, so it's not going to move much, but it can move, so that means I've got no binding. Now, as you can see, I just put a fingerprint on there, so I'm going to go over this one more time with the brake cleaner and clean up the rotor surface. But I want to be careful with the brake cleaner at this point that I don't get it in any of the bearings or seals or any of that sort of thing. That stuff can dilute the grease if it gets in there and cause more problems than it solves. So I'll give this a light clean, and I'll try and get both sides of the rotor here, although it may be tough because there's a dust shield on the back, but I'll kind of do my best. And then it'll be time to put the wheel back on and go to the other side. Okay, so I'm going to pull this lug nut back off of here since I don't need it anymore. Okay, and as you can see, I finger tightened these little plastic hubcap nuts, but I do actually always give them a little bit of a crank with the lug wrench just to make sure they're tight. But you certainly want to be gentle here, because since they are plastic, if you just put way too much on there, they're going to strip out. So like I said, just a gentle little snug just to make sure that everything's tight and doesn't fall off. Okay, so that's just about it for the pad and rotor replacement on this side of the car anyway. I'm going to go around to the other side and do those as well, but the procedure is more or less the same. And if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to leave a comment or subscribe, feel free to do that as well. Thanks for watching.